Hello and God bless you. Well, today we continue our series in a study of King David. We're in part 2. I was kind of working on what I wanted to discuss over this series this week, and unfortunately it will be kind of long. We will be in this series for a little bit of time. I thought of something I wanted to do that I thought was kind of interesting to wrap up the series with. Unfortunately, there would be a lot of verses to cover in one part, so we will split the very end into 2 parts, because I don't think anybody wants to hear me talk for an hour. But we're continuing in part 2 today, and last week we started our study of the life of King David, and as I said, we can learn a lot from King David, because King David was a man after God's own heart. And what I mean by that is, David messed up a lot. We're going to see that through this series. King David was in no way perfect, but as we'll see in the series, David kept his eyes on God. Last week we gave an introduction, which was leading to King David. We never actually started talking about King David last week. But we were talking about everything that led it up to King David. We talked about how there wasn't a certain verse that said God is your king during the Israelites' time in the wilderness. But as we see, it was understood by the Israelites in the wilderness before they entered the promised land that God was their king. They knew that God was their God and their king and their ruler, and they understood that when they were there in the wilderness, when Moses was talking to them, that they had no need for a king because God was their king. They understood that. But God, knowing the end from the beginning, knew that one day they would want a king and demand one to be like everybody in all the countries around them. Wanted a physical king ruling over them. So a few decades later, God raised up Samuel to be a prophet, and the Israelites did exactly what God had said they were going to do, and we read those verses last week where God said that one day you will demand a king. And the Israelites did. They came to Samuel, and they demanded a king because they wanted to be like everybody else. And there's just a few verses from last week. We're going to go over them again. They're just some important verses that I hope you kind of keep in your mind. The first one is 1 Samuel 8:7. Israel rejects God as their king. And it says, "And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken to the voice of the people, and all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." And then we're going to 1 Samuel chapter 10. We're going to read 18 and 19. And I like this. We talked about last week how I like this. Samuel calls out the Israelites for rejecting God as their king. And he says, "And he said unto the children of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and delivered you out of the hands of the Egyptian, and out of the hands of all kingdoms, and of them that oppressed you. And you have this day rejected your God, who himself saved you out of all your adversaries and your tribulations, and you have said unto him, Nay, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands." Also, we seen this last week, and we'll cover it again. Hosea chapter 13, verse 11. God gives Israel a king in his anger, and says, "I gave them a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. Then we saw last week how God had raised up Saul to become a king. And also last week we saw how God took the kingdom from Saul. Of course, that doesn't mean that Saul's kingdom was taken away immediately. God allowed Saul to remain king until his death. But what God did is, usually it's common for a king after he dies for his son to reign in his place. So Saul's son should have been king after him, but God took the kingdom away from Saul. And we see last week God told Saul that he was taking away Saul's kingdom and giving it to his neighbor, and we've seen that in 1 Samuel 15:28. And Samuel said unto him, The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. So now we're finally going to get into talking about King David, and we're going to be first in 1 Samuel chapter 16, where we're going to see David is anointed king the first time in Bethlehem. And we're going to read 1 through 7 and then 10 through 13. And it says, And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing that I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have proven me a king among his sons. And Samuel said, How can I go? If Saul hear it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, Take a heifer with thee, and say that I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee. And Samuel did what the Lord spoke, and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming, and said, Cometh thou peaceably? And he said, Peaceably, I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and called them to the sacrifice. And it came to pass when they were come, that he looked on Eliab, and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, nor on the height of his stature, because I refused him. For the Lord seeth not as a man seeth. For a man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. And now we're going to skip on to verse 10. We're going to read 10 through 13. Again, Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, The Lord hath not chosen these. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Are here all thy children? And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down until he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was a ruddy, and withal a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look on. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil, and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now we're going to continue on here in 1 Samuel 16, and we're going to see how David saves Saul. We're going to read 14 through 23. And it says, "But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said unto him, Behold, now an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants, which are before thee, to seek out a man who is a cunning player on a harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. And Saul said unto his servants, Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. Then answered one of the servants and said, Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. Wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse, and said, Send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And Jesse took an ass laden with bread, and a bottle of wine, and a kid, and he sent them by David his son unto Saul. And David came to Saul, and he stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armbearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took a harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him." So now we're going to go on, and we're going to talk about David fighting Goliath. This is going to be a lot of from our chapter today. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine? And ye servants to Saul, choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me, and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him, and kill him, then shall ye be our servants, and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now we're going to skip on down to 16 and read through 18. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of the parcel of corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their thousands, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now we're going to skip on down to 23 and read through 29. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spoke according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that cometh up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth the Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spoke unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why comest thou hither? And with whom hast thou left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And now we're going to skip on down, and we're going to read 32 through 51. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight against this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant keepeth his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. See, I like David's attitude right here, because the Israelites see Goliath, this huge man. We seen his height up there. I don't know what exactly that'd be offhand, but they were scared. But Goliath was mocking the Israelite army and basically mocking God. So David, this young guy, probably a teenager. I mean, I don't know. You hear different theories about how old he was, but he's upset that this man is mocking his God. and the armies of his God, and the people of his God. So he tells Saul that he's ready to fight this Philistine, and Saul tells him that he can't, and he's like, I faced down a bear and a lion. This Philistine ain't nothing. He's going to fall in my hand just like the lion and the bear that I killed. So anyway, let's continue on 37. And David said, Moreover, the Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, the Lord be with thee. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head, and he also armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he arrayed, essayed to go, for he had not proven it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proven them. And David put them off. And here, when it's talking about proving them, I've heard a couple different things. Some people say that Saul's armor was too big for David, and that he couldn't move in it. It's like a little kid. You know, I can think about it like a movie or something, and you got like this kid putting on an adult size like night suit or something, you know, and he's just stumbling around. But when I looked up proving it, it means that, you know, he wasn't used to it. It wasn't, to me, it seemed like it wasn't so much that it was just that he couldn't move in it, like it was too big for him. I think it was more that it just wasn't something he was comfortable with wearing. It wasn't something he was used to. And he figured it would probably hinder his motion. You know, he wasn't a soldier yet, so he wasn't used to wearing this armor. So he said, you know, I never went with armor. I'm not used to it, so right now it's going to limit my mobility. So I want to go how I did when I faced the lion and the bear. But whatever way it proved it means, if you believe that it was too big for him and he was just clunking around and he couldn't walk, or he just wasn't familiar with it, didn't feel comfortable with it, whatever you want to say. I just thought I'd throw that out there because when I saw that, it was kind of interesting. I may not have quoted exactly like I'd kind of seen, but I always, you know, by the descriptions people would say at church, I always just thought of like a little kid. Like you'd see like an old cartoon or something where kid's in this like knight's armor and he's just clunking around and falls over and the head for the helmet goes rolling around because the kid can't support the weight and everything. Anyway, let's continue on to 40. And he took a staff in his hand, and he chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even a script. And a sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came and drew near unto David, and the man that bore his shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, a ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. I like what David says here. This is so good. That's what I love about this story. This is right here about how these thousands of Israel's army are shaking in their armor. They're just probably, armor's just like metal's just clinking together because their like knees are knocking. And you got this young shepherd boy, however old he is, young man, no armor at all, just dressed like you'd see him in a field. He comes out to fight this Philistine. This Philistine's like, are you kidding me? You got these thousands of people here, and you send this guy who doesn't look like he's prepared for war. But like what he says here, then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. I was right the first time. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee, and I will take thy head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And this assembly shall know that the Lord saved not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hastened and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag, and took thence a stone, and slung it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now we're going to go on to chapter 18. We'll read 1 through 9 to start off with, and we see how David is set over Saul's army, and how Saul becomes jealous of David. First in 18, 1 through 9. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and he gave it to David, and his garments, and even to his sword, and his bow, and to his girdle. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of the Saul's servants. Get a little tongue tied there. And it came to pass, as they came, when David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourets, and with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and saying displeased and the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And now we're going to skip on to verse 12. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. And now we're going to go on and skip down to verse 17. And we're going to read through 29 and see how Saul tries to have David killed by the hand of the Philistines. And Saul said unto David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, Let not my hand be upon him, let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, Who am I, and what is my life, or my family in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law to the king? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel the Meholite to wife. But Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wherefore Saul said to David, Thou shalt this day be my son-in-law, in the one of the twine. And Saul commanded his servants, saying, Commune with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke those words to the ears of David, in the ears of David. And David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spoke David. And Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to avenge the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hands of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew the Philistines 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet more afraid of David. Saul became David's enemy continually. And now we're going to read 3 verses in 1 Samuel 19. We're going to read 8 through 10. And we see how Saul tries to kill David. There was a war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines, and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. And the evil spirit of the Lord was upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but it slipped away out of Saul's presence. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. And now we're going to see how Jonathan helps David. And then we're going to be in, as we see here, 1 Samuel chapter 20. We're going to read 1 through 10. And if you look at our sermon notes, you will see that this story of Jonathan helping David is also in Psalms 59, 1 through 17. So if you want to look at the sermon notes, you can also read that psalm if you like. We have the sermon notes for every part of this series will be organized into sections, and we'll have in parentheses some verses that connect to a story with something else that we didn't cover. And for this will be Psalms 59, 1 through 17, but we didn't include that. But let's continue on. 1 Samuel 1 through 10. And David fled from Naioth in Ramah, and came and said before Jonathan, What have I done? And what is my iniquity? And what is my sin before thy father? And he seeketh my life. And he said unto him, God forbid that thou should die. Behold, my father will do nothing else, great or small, but that he will show it me. Why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. And David swore moreover and said, Thy father certainly knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes. And he saith, Let not Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved, but truly as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death. Then said Jonathan to David, Whatsoever thy soul desireth, I will even do it for thee. And David said unto Jonathan, Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I shall not fail to sit with the king at meat, but let me go and hide myself in the field until the third day at evening. And if thy father at all miss me, then say, David earnestly asked to leave of me, that he might run to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. And if he say thus, it is well, thy servant shall have peace. But if he be very wroth, then be sure that evil is determined by him. Therefore thou shalt deal kindly with thy servant, for thou hast brought thy servant into the covenant of the Lord with thee. Notwithstanding, if there be in me iniquity, slay me thyself. Why shouldst thou bring me to thy father? And Jonathan said, Far be it from thee, for I know certainly that evil were determined by my father to come upon thee. Then would not I tell thee? Then David said to Jonathan, Who shall tell me, or what if thy father answereth thee roughly? Well, that's all we have for part 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Because like I said, I think that we can learn a lot from King David, from his life. You know, he's definitely was a man after God's own heart. He was the man that tried to do everything that God wanted him to do, and like we said, he wasn't perfect. He messed up a lot, as we'll see in the series, but he always kept his eyes on God. He never turned his back on God. Anyway, I pray you got something out of this part 2. If you did, give God glory. Can't wait to see what the Lord has next week for us with this series. If he lets it continue, he may tell me to bring something else out. We'll see. But don't take my word. Everybody else's for the read the word for yourself. Pray to God daily, even if it's just in the car on your way to work. Just keep a relationship with God, because we truly don't know how long we got on this earth, and we need to be serious about our relationship with God. We need to do like King David and keep our eyes on God and keep seeking Him. I love you. God bless you. I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next week, God willing.